Hello and welcome. When the German Wehrmacht launched its invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the world bore witness to the largest military operation in human history. It was called Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, a figure of conquest and power. For Adolf Hitler and his generals, this campaign was not only a strategic gamble, but also an ideological war. They believed that by marching east, they could crush communism, seize the vast resources of Soviet lands, and secure what they called Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. On that quiet Sunday morning, along a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, over 3 million Axis soldiers crossed the Soviet border. It was a line of fire stretching for nearly 3,000 kilometers, with hundreds of thousands of vehicles, thousands of tanks, and the roar of the Luftwaffe filling the skies. For many Soviet citizens, it began like any other day. Farmers were tending their fields, townspeople were enjoying the warmth of early summer, and soldiers in border posts stood at their stations unaware of the tidal wave about to crash over them. The Germans struck with overwhelming force. Their blitzkrieg strategy, honed in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, relied on speed, surprise, and concentrated armor. Panzer divisions cut deep into Soviet territory, bypassing strongpoints, encircling entire armies. Infantry divisions followed, securing the ground and taking prisoners. Above them, waves of German aircraft swept across Soviet airfields, catching hundreds of planes on the ground and destroying them before they ever took off. In the first hours of the campaign, the Soviet Air Force lost more than 1,000 aircraft. Entire formations were obliterated before pilots could react. For the Red Army, this was not simply a battle, it was a catastrophe. The opening moves of Operation Barbarossa resembled a storm so sudden and so vast that even the most seasoned Soviet commanders were left reeling. Yet, for all the devastation, the story of the invasion was not simply one of lightning speed and German triumph. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the chaos of collapsing fronts, there was also resistance, confusion, and a desperate attempt to hold the line. Soviet border guards, outnumbered and outgunned, often fought to the last man. Villagers fled eastward, carrying what little they could, while others took up arms in partisan bands that would grow into a formidable underground force in the months to come. The strategic vision. Hitler's ambitions for Operation Barbarossa were immense. He envisioned a swift campaign lasting no more than a few months, in which the Red Army would collapse just as Poland and France had fallen before it. His generals, many of them veterans of lightning victories, largely agreed. They believed that once Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev were captured, the Soviet Union would disintegrate. But this was no ordinary enemy. The Soviet Union was not a small nation. It was a continental empire stretching from Europe deep into Asia. Its population numbered in the hundreds of millions. Its resources were vast: oil, coal, steel, grain, and though the Red Army had been weakened by Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s, it was still formidable in size. Nevertheless, the Germans pressed forward. They divided their invasion into 3 great army groups: Army Group North, advancing toward Leningrad; Army Group Center, striking at Moscow; and Army Group South, pushing into Ukraine. Each was massive in its own right, yet coordinated as part of a single overwhelming blow. For the Soviets, the first days were marked by disbelief. Despite warnings from intelligence, Stalin had convinced himself that Germany would not break the non-aggression pact signed in 1939. Even as reports of German planes bombing Soviet cities poured in, he hesitated to believe. His silence in those first days added to the confusion among commanders in the field, many of whom were left without clear orders. The shock of the first battles. The opening clashes of Operation Barbarossa were disasters for the Soviets. At the frontiers, entire armies were encircled. In the Great Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, German panzers swept around Soviet forces with astonishing speed, trapping hundreds of thousands of men. Within days, the Soviets had lost nearly 500,000 soldiers, dead, wounded, or captured. German accounts speak of endless columns of Soviet prisoners, marching westward under guard, faces blank with shock and exhaustion. Villages and towns fell one after another. Supply depots were seized, trains derailed, communication lines cut. It seemed as though nothing could stop the Wehrmacht's advance. And yet, amidst the chaos, Soviet soldiers resisted. In countless small pockets, units fought stubbornly, buying precious hours or days. Machine gun nests held their ground until overrun. Artillery crews fired until their last shells were gone. Entire battalions perished in the fields, but their sacrifice slowed the German timetable ever so slightly. These fragments of resistance, while seeming insignificant at the time, accumulated into a pattern. The invasion was not as effortless as Hitler had promised. Life behind the front lines. For civilians, the invasion was a shattering experience. Families woke to the sound of bombing raids. Entire towns were reduced to rubble in hours. Refugees streamed eastward, clogging the roads with carts, livestock, and whatever belongings they could carry. Fields of grain, once promising a summer harvest, were trampled under the tracks of tanks. German occupation policies were brutal. Civilians were subjected to mass shootings, forced labor, and the beginning of a campaign of terror that would scar Eastern Europe. For Jewish communities in particular, the invasion marked the beginning of the Holocaust in the East, as Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed in the wake of the army, executing entire populations. In the cities still under Soviet control, there was a mixture of fear and determination. Moscow and Leningrad began to prepare for defense. Factories switched to wartime production, churning out weapons, ammunition, and uniforms. Workers, often women and children, labored around the clock. The Soviet state began the massive evacuation of industry to the east, dismantling entire factories and shipping them beyond the Urals, where German bombs could not reach. Stalin and the Soviet response. For Stalin, the opening weeks of Barbarossa were a personal and political crisis. His failure to anticipate the invasion left the Red Army vulnerable. Yet as the shock wore off, he began to reassert control. On July 3, 1941, he addressed the nation for the first time since the invasion, calling on the Soviet people to rise in defense of their motherland. His words were simple but powerful. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, fighters of our army and navy. A great danger hangs over our country. The enemy is cruel and implacable. He has set himself the task of seizing our lands, our water, our bread. He has come to enslave and destroy our people. We must stand firm and fight to the last drop of blood. This speech marked a turning point. The Soviet people, though battered, now had a rallying cry. Across the nation, volunteers joined militias. Factories redoubled their efforts. Propaganda posters urged resistance, depicting German soldiers as monstrous invaders to be driven out. The war was no longer a conflict between armies, it was a struggle for survival. The Wehrmacht's overconfidence. In the first weeks, German commanders were jubilant. Reports of massive Soviet surrenders filled their headquarters. Many believed that the campaign was already won. German soldiers wrote letters home confident that Moscow would fall by autumn, that the war in the East would be over quickly. But beneath this confidence lay hidden cracks. The Soviet Union's vastness meant that even as German armies advanced hundreds of kilometers, the front only seemed to grow longer and more stretched. Supply lines became increasingly strained. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to be carried over poor roads, across rivers, and through forests. The Wehrmacht was fast, but not invincible. Moreover, the Soviet ability to replace losses astonished the Germans. Despite losing hundreds of thousands of men, new armies seemed to appear again and again. Factories relocated east continued to produce weapons. The Soviet spirit of resistance, hardened by the brutality of the invasion, did not collapse. A war of ideology. It is important to understand that Barbarossa was not merely a military campaign. It was also a war of ideology. For Hitler, the invasion was about annihilation, not negotiation. He spoke openly of destroying Judeo-Bolshevism, of reducing the Soviet population, and of reshaping Eastern Europe into a German colony. For the Soviets, this meant there was no possibility of surrender. To lose meant extermination. The war took on a new character, total, unrelenting, and merciless. This ideological intensity fueled the desperation and determination of both sides. As we imagine these opening days of Operation Barbarossa, it is easy to be swept away by the scale of numbers and battles. Millions of men in motion, thousands of machines, the roar of planes overhead. Yet beneath the statistics are countless personal stories. A Soviet soldier clutching his rifle as German tanks loom in the distance. A German infantryman trudging through fields, wondering how far Moscow lies ahead. a mother leading her children down a dusty road, the smoke of burning villages rising behind her. The opening chapter of the war on the Eastern Front was brutal, swift, and overwhelming. It marked the beginning of a struggle that would last for 4 long years, stretching from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Berlin. But in June of 1941, none of this was yet known. For those living it, the future was uncertain, the present filled with fire and fear. And so, as we settle into this story, we do so with calm voices, tracing the path of armies and the endurance of people. The thunder of Operation Barbarossa was only the beginning. The road to Moscow lay ahead, paved with sacrifice, suffering, and resilience. The story of how Hitler's armies surged forward and how the Soviet Union braced itself to withstand the storm will unfold step by step. For now, let the images linger. Endless columns of soldiers crossing into Soviet lands, villages aflame, skies filled with smoke, and the heavy weight of history pressing down on Europe. It is a beginning that seemed unstoppable. Yet, as we shall see, even the most powerful armies can falter when faced with vastness, determination, and the harsh hand of nature. The summer of 1941 was one of movement, of dust rising over endless roads, of armies surging forward across fields, forests, and rivers. After the shock of Operation Barbarossa's opening strikes, the German Wehrmacht pressed deeper into Soviet territory. Their eyes were fixed on Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet Union. Yet the road to Moscow was not a straight line. It was a long, grinding path marked by battles of encirclement, desperate defenses, and the beginnings of resistance that would only grow stronger. For Hitler and his generals, the strategy seemed simple. Strike fast, keep advancing, and prevent the Red Army from regrouping. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, the summer was a time of retreat, improvisation, and sacrifice. The land itself became a battlefield as villages, rivers, and forests were swallowed by the fire of war. The advance through Belarus. By early July, the German Army Group Center had already delivered crushing blows. The battles of Bialystok and Minsk ended with enormous Soviet losses, hundreds of thousands captured. The panzers of commanders like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth drove relentlessly eastward, covering vast distances in days. Their tanks and armored vehicles, spearheaded by motorized infantry, cut through defenses like blades, leaving stunned Soviet forces scrambling to regroup. The city of Smolensk, about halfway between the border and Moscow, became the next great objective. The Germans believed that once Smolensk fell, the road to Moscow would lie open. In their reports, commanders were confident that victory was close. Letters home spoke of marching to Moscow as though it were a certainty. Yet the Soviets were not beaten. At Smolensk, in July and August, the Red Army launched counterattacks that surprised the Germans. These were not enough to stop the encirclements, but they slowed the advance. Soviet soldiers fought fiercely, often with outdated equipment and poor coordination, but with determination that unsettled their enemy. The Battle of Smolensk raged for weeks. German divisions succeeded in encircling several Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands more prisoners. But the Soviet resistance bought precious time. It delayed the German timetable, forcing the Wehrmacht to fight for territory it had expected to take with ease. In those crucial weeks, Soviet factories continued to produce tanks and planes, and new armies were being raised further east. The endless columns. Life on the road to Moscow was marked by endless marching. German soldiers trudged along dusty tracks, their boots caked with mud, their uniforms stained with sweat. Tanks rumbled forward, their engines roaring, leaving behind trails of churned earth. Horses pulled wagons loaded with supplies, artillery, and ammunition. For all its mechanization, the Wehrmacht still relied heavily on horses, and the strain on these animals was immense. For Soviet civilians, the sight of these endless columns was both terrifying and surreal. Villages watched as grey-clad soldiers marched past, some waving, others shouting orders, many too exhausted to acknowledge the locals. Behind the front lines, German administration began to take hold, often brutally. Food was requisitioned, buildings commandeered, and entire communities uprooted. The pace of war created its own rhythm. Days began with the rising sun, as men packed their gear, shouldered rifles, and set out once more. The air was filled with the buzz of aircraft, the grinding of tank treads, and the rumble of trucks. Nights were restless, with soldiers sleeping in fields, under hedgerows, or in abandoned barns, their dreams haunted by the battles of the day and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Soviet counterattacks. Despite devastating losses, the Soviet command refused to give in. At Smolensk, and later near Yelnya and Roslavl, Soviet forces launched counteroffensives. These attacks were costly, often poorly coordinated, but they revealed something critical: the Red Army was learning. Commanders began to adapt to the German style of warfare, using concentrated armor and countermaneuvers instead of static defenses. One significant moment came with the Soviet counterattack at Yelnya in late August. For the first time since the invasion began, Soviet troops managed to retake ground from the Germans, forcing them to withdraw from a salient. The victory was small compared to the scale of the war, but it carried symbolic weight. It showed the Soviet people that the Wehrmacht could be beaten. It boosted morale at a time when despair threatened to engulf the nation. For German soldiers, these counterattacks were frustrating. They expected a broken enemy, yet they faced stubborn resistance. Each Soviet counterstrike inflicted losses, destroyed vehicles, and stretched supply lines thinner. Though the Germans still advanced, the illusion of an easy campaign was beginning to fade. The civilian experience. As the front moved eastward, civilians were caught in its wake. Families fled with whatever they could carry, streaming along roads that were already choked with soldiers and vehicles. Old men pulled carts, women carried infants, children stumbled alongside, clutching small bundles of clothes or food. Some villages were evacuated by Soviet authorities, while others were left to face the German occupiers alone. Those who stayed behind faced a grim reality. The German occupation was harsh, often merciless. Food stocks were seized, leaving locals hungry. Partisan warfare began almost immediately as civilians took up arms or aided Soviet fighters. In response, the Germans launched reprisals, burning villages, executing hostages, and instilling fear. Amidst this suffering, life struggled to continue. In some towns, markets still opened, bread was baked, and fields were worked. But the shadow of war was everywhere. At night, the glow of fires could be seen on the horizon, and the distant thud of artillery reminded all that the front was never far away. The German command dilemma. By late August, the Wehrmacht had reached a critical juncture. Smolensk had fallen, but Moscow still lay far ahead. German generals debated the next step. Should they push directly toward Moscow, or should they turn south to encircle Soviet armies in Ukraine, capturing the rich resources of the region? Hitler intervened decisively. Against the advice of some generals, he ordered a diversion of forces to the south, aiming to destroy Soviet armies around Kiev. This decision delayed the direct advance on Moscow by weeks. It would prove one of the most consequential decisions of the campaign. The Germans believed they could afford the delay. They still thought the Soviet Union was collapsing, that one more massive encirclement would bring victory. But every week bought time for the Soviets to rebuild, reinforce, and prepare defenses around Moscow. The encirclement of Kiev. The shift to the south led to one of the largest encirclements in military history. The Battle of Kiev. German forces, supported by Army Group South, surrounded vast Soviet armies in Ukraine. By late September, over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped and captured. The scale of the defeat was staggering. From the German perspective, it was a triumph. Propaganda hailed it as proof that the Red Army was finished. Yet, strategically, it was costly. The diversion delayed the advance on Moscow, pushing the timetable into autumn, and autumn in Russia carried its own dangers: rains, mud, and the looming specter of winter. For Soviet soldiers, Kiev was a tragedy. Entire armies vanished into captivity. Families were torn apart, communities shattered. Yet, as devastating as the loss was, it did not break the Soviet Union. Behind the front, new armies were forming. Factories continued to produce tanks and planes. The will to fight remained unbroken. The long road east. As September turned into October, German columns turned back toward Moscow. The advance resumed with Operation Typhoon, the great offensive aimed at capturing the Soviet capital before winter set in. The road to Moscow stretched before them, long, difficult, and uncertain. For the soldiers who marched along it, the campaign already felt endless. Supplies grew harder to obtain, vehicles broke down from constant use. Horses died in the thousands, their bodies left by the roadside. Men grew weary, their faces lined with dust and exhaustion. Letters home grew less confident, reflecting the strain of months of fighting. For Soviet defenders, the stakes were higher than ever. Moscow was not just a city. It was the symbol of Soviet power, the political and administrative center of the nation. To lose Moscow would have been a devastating blow, and so defenses were built, militias armed, and the entire population prepared for the struggle to come. The road to Moscow in the summer of 1941 was more than a military advance. It was a journey through suffering, resilience, and the testing of human endurance. German soldiers pressed forward with confidence, believing they were on the brink of victory. Soviet soldiers fell back, regrouped, and counterattacked, slowly learning how to resist. Civilians bore the brunt of occupation, displacement, and violence. When we picture this road, we can imagine long lines of soldiers under a blazing summer sun, their shadows stretching across the dust. We can see tanks lumbering forward, engines straining, leaving behind trails of black smoke. We can hear the distant thunder of artillery, the drone of aircraft overhead, the cries of refugees. And yet, we also see resilience, Soviet troops regrouping at Smolensk, civilians forming partisan bands in forests, workers dismantling factories and moving them east, a people refusing to collapse, even as the enemy pressed relentlessly forward. The summer of 1941 was a season of fire and fear, but also of endurance. The road to Moscow was long, but it would not be easy. Each mile gained by the Wehrmacht came at a cost. Each day delayed brought winter closer. And so, as we close this chapter, we leave the German armies pressing eastward, confident but strained. Ahead lies Moscow, glittering in the distance like a prize, but between them and the Soviet capital lies mud, frost, and resistance. The storm is gathering, and the road ahead will test them in ways they cannot yet imagine. The summer had turned to autumn, and the German armies were still advancing. The cities of the Western Soviet Union, Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, had already fallen into enemy hands. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead or captured, the Red Army was battered and bleeding, and now the Wehrmacht was turning its eyes toward the greatest prize of all, Moscow. For the Soviet capital, the threat was not distant anymore. By September 1941, the German panzers of Army Group Center were less than 300 kilometers away. The citizens of Moscow could hear the war approaching in the thunder of artillery on the horizon and the wail of air raid sirens overhead. The government, the army, and the people understood. If Moscow fell, it could mean the collapse of the entire Soviet Union. And so, the city prepared itself for the storm. The symbol of Moscow. Moscow was not just another city, it was the heart of Soviet power, the seat of government, and the symbol of resistance. Its wide boulevards, ancient churches, and the red walls of the Kremlin stood as reminders of both Russia's long history and its new Soviet identity. The city was also a hub of transportation and communication. From Moscow, rail lines radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, connecting the capital to the rest of the vast nation. Hitler and his generals believed that capturing Moscow would deal a fatal blow to Soviet morale. They thought the fall of the city would paralyze Soviet leadership and send the Red Army into chaos. But for Stalin and his people, Moscow represented survival itself. To lose it was unthinkable. This symbolic weight shaped the mood of the city. Every citizen, soldier, and worker felt the gravity of what was coming. The air grew heavy with a mixture of fear and determination. Civil defense and the people's effort. When the German threat drew near, the Soviet leadership mobilized the entire population of Moscow for defense. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, were drafted into building fortifications. Along the outskirts of the city, trenches were dug, anti-tank ditches carved into the earth, and barricades erected across highways. Wooden obstacles called hedgehogs were built to block enemy tanks. Factories that once produced tractors or consumer goods now churned out weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Workers toiled day and night in shifts, often sleeping on factory floors. The spirit of total war took hold. Everyone, regardless of age or profession, was expected to contribute. Students, clerks, and even artists and writers were issued shovels instead of pens, working long hours on defensive lines. Entire neighborhoods volunteered to strengthen the barricades or dig shelters. Moscow became a fortress, not just of stone and steel, but of human resolve. Evacuation of industry and people. At the same time, the Soviet government launched one of the largest evacuations in history. Knowing that the Germans might reach Moscow, Stalin ordered critical industries, universities, and cultural treasures to be moved east, far beyond the reach of the invaders. Trains packed with machinery, workers, and their families left daily for the Ural Mountains, Siberia, and Central Asia. Entire factories were dismantled, piece by piece, and rebuilt thousands of kilometers away. Workers often traveled with the machines they operated, ensuring production could resume quickly after relocation. This evacuation was chaotic, exhausting, and often heartbreaking. Families were separated, journeys were long and cold, and conditions were harsh, yet it saved the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. Even as Moscow prepared for defense, the relocated factories in the east would continue to produce tanks, planes, and weapons that would sustain the Red Army. For the people of Moscow, the evacuation was both a sign of fear and of resilience. Some wept as trains carried away their loved ones. Others took comfort in the knowledge that their sacrifices ensured the survival of the Soviet state. Stalin's decision to stay. As the German threat loomed, rumors spread that the Soviet government would abandon Moscow. Some citizens feared the city would be surrendered, just as other capitals in Europe had fallen before the Wehrmacht. The panic grew worse when government offices began moving eastward and foreign embassies closed or relocated. But Stalin made a fateful decision. He would stay in Moscow. On October 19, 1941, as German armies closed in, the Soviet government declared a state of siege in the capital. At that moment, Stalin's presence in the city became a powerful symbol. His decision not to flee reassured the people. They saw that their leader remained with them, sharing the danger. On November 7th, during the anniversary of the October Revolution, Stalin went further. Despite the crisis, he ordered the traditional military parade on Red Square to go ahead. Soldiers marched across the cobblestones of the Kremlin, their boots echoing in the cold air. From the reviewing stand, Stalin addressed them, declaring that the enemy was at the gates, but Moscow would never fall. Those same soldiers, after the parade, marched directly to the front lines. For the citizens of Moscow, the spectacle was unforgettable. It was both a rallying cry and a promise: Moscow would be defended to the last. The atmosphere in the city. Life in Moscow during the autumn of 1941 was tense and surreal. The streets were filled with barricades, trenches, and sandbags. Posters urged citizens to resist with slogans like "Everything for the front, everything for victory." Loudspeakers broadcast news and patriotic songs to keep spirits high. Yet the fear was palpable. German aircraft bombed the city repeatedly, targeting factories, rail stations, and residential areas. Air raid sirens wailed and citizens hurried into underground shelters. The Moscow metro, with its deep tunnels, became a refuge for thousands who slept on platforms at night as bombs rumbled above. Food grew scarce, bread rations were cut, and long lines formed outside shops. People bartered with neighbors, trading clothes or furniture for a little flour or sugar. Still, there was determination. Citizens whispered that if the Germans came, they would fight with rifles, pistols, or even bare hands. The role of propaganda. The Soviet state understood the power of morale. Newspapers and posters emphasized heroic stories of Soviet soldiers and workers. Radio broadcasts assured the people that the Red Army was fighting bravely, that reinforcements were on their way, that Moscow would hold. Photographs of German atrocities in occupied territories were circulated to remind citizens of the stakes. This was not a war of conquest. It was a war of survival. To surrender was to invite destruction. At the same time, Soviet propaganda elevated Moscow to near mystical status. It was portrayed as the heart of the revolution, the fortress of socialism, the city that could never be conquered. These messages bolstered courage even as the front drew nearer. Foreign eyes on Moscow. The defense of Moscow also captured the world's attention. Journalists and diplomats still in the city reported on the atmosphere. Some doubted the Soviets could hold out, others were impressed by the resilience of the people. For Britain and the United States, who had recently become allies of the Soviet Union, Moscow's fate was critical. Supplies of weapons, trucks, and raw materials began to arrive through the Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor, though in small numbers at first. The Western Allies understood. If Moscow fell, the Soviet Union might collapse, leaving Germany dominant in Europe. Thus, the city's defense became not only a Soviet concern, but a matter of global importance. The growing tension. By October, the German advance had resumed with new ferocity under Operation Typhoon. Towns and villages west of Moscow fell one by one. Refugees poured into the capital, their stories filled with horror. Panic spread. For a brief period in October, Moscow itself teetered on the edge of chaos. Shops were looted, government offices burned documents, and some citizens fled eastward on their own. But order was restored through stern measures. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, patrolled the streets, executing deserters and looters. Curfews were enforced. The message was clear: Moscow would stand, and panic would not be tolerated. As the days grew colder, the tension deepened. Snow began to fall. German soldiers were now within striking distance. Citizens waited for the clash they knew was coming. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. To imagine Moscow in those days is to picture a city both terrified and defiant. Streets filled with barricades and trenches, citizens carrying buckets of sand to fight fires after air raids, soldiers marching from Red Square to the front lines, families huddled in metro tunnels, listening to the distant rumble of bombs. There was fear, but also a sense of unity. Everyone, from the highest leader to the humblest worker, shared the burden. Moscow was not abandoned, it was defended. As we reflect calmly, we can almost see the quiet determination in the faces of the people. A mother standing in a bread line, clutching her child's hand. A worker tightening the last bolt on a machine before it is shipped east. A soldier, rifle in hand, watching over a trench in the outskirts, snow beginning to fall on his shoulders. The preparations of Moscow were more than physical, they were psychological. The city was steeling itself, turning fear into resolve. The people knew the storm was coming, but they were ready to face it. By late autumn, Moscow was transformed. The factories had been evacuated, the trenches dug, the people mobilized. Stalin remained in the Kremlin, his presence a defiant gesture. The Red Army was gathering strength, reinforced by new divisions from Siberia and the east. The Germans were approaching, confident that the city would soon fall, but Moscow was prepared. It was no longer just a city, it was a fortress, a symbol, and the heart of a nation's will to survive. The stage was set for one of the greatest battles in history. By the early days of October 1941, the German High Command believed that victory in the east was within their grasp. The Wehrmacht had swept across the Soviet Union with extraordinary speed, capturing vast territories, encircling entire armies, and taking millions of prisoners. Yet Moscow still stood defiant, a beacon of Soviet resistance. It was then that Adolf Hitler ordered the final great push. The offensive was given a name full of menace and ambition: Operation Typhoon. It was to be the blow that would end the Soviet Union in one decisive stroke, capturing the capital before winter and forcing Stalin's government to collapse. The Germans envisioned a quick, overwhelming operation. They would crush the Soviet armies defending the approaches to Moscow, surround the city, and seize it. The plan promised another lightning victory, swift, bold, and devastating. But as the operation unfolded, it would reveal both the strengths and the limits of the Wehrmacht. And for the Soviet Union, it would mark one of the darkest, yet most defining moments of the war. The plan for Moscow. Operation Typhoon was launched by Army Group Center, the most powerful of the German army groups on the Eastern Front. It was commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, with famed panzer leaders like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth leading armored spearheads. The plan was ambitious. 3 massive pincer movements would encircle Soviet forces west of Moscow. Once these armies were destroyed, nothing would prevent the Germans from marching into the capital. The timing was critical. The German leadership was well aware of the looming Russian winter. They knew that once the rains of autumn began, the roads would turn to mud, slowing their advance. And once the snow fell, the freezing cold would become a deadly enemy. Thus, Operation Typhoon had to be swift. Every day mattered. Hitler himself was confident. In speeches and directives, he declared that Moscow would fall quickly, that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. German soldiers were told they would spend Christmas in the Soviet capital. The opening encirclements. On October 2, 1941, the offensive began. German panzers surged forward, cutting deep into Soviet lines. The Red Army, already weakened from months of retreat and enormous losses, struggled to hold the front. Two great battles defined the opening phase of Typhoon, the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. German forces executed their classic blitzkrieg tactics, driving armored wedges deep behind Soviet defenses and linking up to trap entire armies. At Vyazma, west of Moscow, 4 Soviet armies found themselves surrounded. At Bryansk, further south, 2 more armies were encircled. The scale of the disaster was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were cut off, with little hope of escape. The fighting inside the pockets was desperate. Soviet troops resisted fiercely, but German artillery and aircraft pounded them relentlessly. Ammunition ran out, food grew scarce, and water was rationed. Many units fought to the last man. Others attempted desperate breakouts, charging through German lines in chaotic battles that often ended in slaughter. When the pockets were finally reduced, the Germans claimed to have captured more than 650,000 prisoners. The numbers were staggering, another catastrophe in a campaign already filled with disasters for the Red Army. German propaganda proclaimed that Soviet resistance was finished, that Moscow would soon fall. The panic in Moscow. News of the encirclement spread quickly. In Moscow, panic began to take hold. Refugees poured into the city, bringing stories of entire armies destroyed, villages burned, and German tanks rumbling ever closer. For several days in October, Moscow seemed on the edge of collapse. Shops were looted, trains eastward were packed with fleeing civilians, and government offices destroyed sensitive documents in preparation for evacuation. Some residents believed the city would be surrendered, just as Kiev and Minsk had been before. But Stalin acted decisively. He declared a state of siege in the capital, placing it under martial law. The NKVD patrolled the streets, executing looters and deserters. Curfews were imposed. The panic was crushed with ruthless force. At the same time, Stalin made a symbolic choice. While some government offices were moved to Kuibyshev, today's Samara, further east, Stalin himself remained in the Kremlin. His presence reassured the people. If the leader would not flee, then the city must endure. The strain on the Wehrmacht. Despite the triumphs of Vyazma and Bryansk, cracks were beginning to appear in the German offensive. The Wehrmacht had advanced hundreds of kilometers, but their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Trucks broke down on primitive roads, fuel grew scarce, and food was in short supply. Autumn rains soon began, turning the dirt roads of Russia into rivers of mud. This period, known as the Rasputitsa, brought the advance to a crawl. Tanks and trucks sank axle-deep in the muck. Horses strained to pull wagons through fields that had become swamps. Soldiers trudged knee-deep in mud, their boots caked and heavy. The German timetable for a swift capture of Moscow began to slip. Every day lost to mud and supply problems brought winter closer, and with it, dangers the Germans were not prepared to face. The Soviet response. For the Soviet Union, Operation Typhoon was a calamity, but it was not the end. Even as armies were encircled and destroyed, new ones were being raised. Soviet factories relocated east of the Urals were beginning to produce weapons and tanks again. Reinforcements from Siberia and Central Asia were on the move. Stalin and his generals refused to surrender. Moscow was fortified with layer upon layer of defenses. Civilians built trenches and anti-tank barriers on the outskirts of the city. Soldiers prepared for street fighting, determined to defend every block if necessary. Propaganda reminded citizens of their duty. Posters declared, "Defend Moscow." Newspapers told stories of heroism at the front. Despite hunger, bombing raids, and fear, the people endured. German overconfidence. In Berlin, the early successes of Typhoon fueled Hitler's belief that victory was inevitable. The encirclements of Vyazma and Bryansk were hailed as proof of German superiority. Hitler declared that the Soviet Union was finished, that the Red Army could not recover from such losses. But on the ground, German soldiers saw a different reality. Even after massive defeats, Soviet troops continued to resist. New units appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Counterattacks struck with unexpected ferocity. What the German leadership dismissed as the last reserves of the Red Army kept reappearing week after week. Letters from the front began to reflect fatigue and doubt. Soldiers wrote of endless marching, of mud that swallowed vehicles, of battles that seemed never-ending. Confidence gave way to exhaustion, though the orders remained the same: advance, encircle, destroy. The human cost. The battles of Operation Typhoon were catastrophic for both sides. Soviet casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions were wiped out. Families waited for news that never came, as sons and fathers vanished into the chaos of war. For the Germans, too, the cost was mounting. Though they claimed victory after victory, each battle drained their strength. Thousands of soldiers fell in the fields and forests of Russia, their graves marked only by wooden crosses. Vehicles wore out, horses died by the tens of thousands, and supplies dwindled. Behind the statistics were human lives. A Soviet soldier shivering in a trench, clutching his rifle. A German infantryman dragging his boots through the mud, dreaming of home. A mother in Moscow writing letters to a son who would never return. The scale of Operation Typhoon was vast, but at its core were countless individuals caught in the storm of history. The approach to Moscow. By late October, despite delays and losses, German forces pushed closer to Moscow. The sound of artillery could be heard from the city's outskirts. German reconnaissance units reached within sight of the spires of the Kremlin. It seemed that Hitler's dream was about to be realized. But the Soviets had not broken. Fresh divisions manned the defenses around the capital. Civilians dug deeper trenches. Stalin remained defiant, and the weather, colder each day, was beginning to turn. Operation Typhoon had opened with triumph, but now it slowed, faltered, and strained. The road to Moscow was not a straight path of victory. It was a gauntlet of mud, frost, and resistance. When we step back and reflect on Operation Typhoon, we see both the might of the Wehrmacht and the resilience of the Soviet Union. The German plan was bold and its opening moves devastating. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. The Red Army seemed on the brink of collapse. Yet history is rarely so simple. The Soviet Union did not fall. Its people endured hunger, fear, and loss, but they refused to surrender. Factories continued to produce weapons. New armies continued to appear. Moscow prepared itself with grim determination. And nature itself intervened. Mud slowed the German advance. The cold crept in. Time, which the Germans thought was on their side, began to turn against them. As we imagine this moment, we can picture endless fields of mud, broken wagons, and weary soldiers trudging forward. We can see the glow of Moscow in the distance, a city waiting, bracing itself, refusing to yield. Operation Typhoon was meant to be the final victory, the storm that would sweep away Soviet resistance. Instead, it became a prelude to one of history's most decisive struggles. By the end of October 1941, the Wehrmacht had advanced closer to Moscow than anyone thought possible in June. The Red Army was bloodied but unbroken. The capital was under siege, but it stood. The storm of Operation Typhoon had battered the Soviet Union, but it had not destroyed it. Ahead lay the Rasputitsa, the freezing winds of winter, and the Soviet counterstroke that no one in Berlin anticipated. The story of Moscow was entering its most critical phase. The German army, overextended and exhausted, stood at the very gates of the city. The Soviet Union, battered yet defiant, prepared for a fight to the death. The fate of Moscow, and perhaps of the entire war, would be decided in the coming weeks. War is often remembered for its battles, its generals, and its victories. Yet sometimes the most decisive force is not an army or a strategy, but nature itself. In Russia, that force has a name: Rasputitsa. the season of mud. As October 1941 unfolded, the German Wehrmacht's drive on Moscow slowed, then staggered, and finally bogged down. The autumn rains arrived, soaking the earth, turning fields into swamps and roads into rivers of sticky clay. Tanks and trucks that had raced across Europe now sank helplessly into the mire. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, unable to drag wagons through the muck. Soldiers trudged knee-deep in slime, their uniforms heavy with filth. The Wehrmacht had come to Russia expecting swift victory, but now it found itself in a battle not against Soviet soldiers, but against the land itself. The Rasputitsa would become one of the defining images of the Eastern Front, a sea of mud swallowing an army whole. The nature of Rasputitsa, the Russian landscape vast and unforgiving, is shaped by extremes of climate. In spring and autumn, when the snow melts or the rains fall, the soil turns soft and waterlogged. Roads, often little more than dirt tracks, dissolve into quagmires. Vehicles sink, horses stumble, and men slip and struggle with every step. The autumn of 1941 brought heavy rains across western Russia. The ground, already churned by the passage of millions of soldiers and vehicles, quickly gave way. Convoys of trucks became stuck axle-deep. Tanks that had once led the advance now sat motionless, their treads clogged with thick mud. Horses, vital to the German army's logistics, collapsed in the sludge, their bodies lining the roadsides. The Rasputitsa was not simply an inconvenience, it was an enemy. It robbed the Wehrmacht of its greatest strength, mobility. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, depended on speed. Without speed, the German advance became sluggish, predictable, and vulnerable. The struggle of the Wehrmacht. For German soldiers, the mud was a daily torment. Marches that should have taken hours stretched into days. Boots were sucked off feet by the mire. Uniforms became soaked and caked with filth. Weapons jammed, food supplies rotted, and fuel ran out. Trucks and tanks broke down in staggering numbers. Mechanics worked day and night in impossible conditions, stripping parts from wrecks to keep a few vehicles running. Supply lines, already stretched thin, became nearly impassable. Ammunition and rations often had to be carried by hand on the backs of exhausted soldiers. Letters from the front paint a picture of misery. Men wrote of sleeping in waterlogged trenches, of eating cold rations in the rain, of never being dry. Some described the landscape as an endless swamp, stretching for miles, with no firm ground in sight. Commanders struggled to maintain momentum. The panzers, once the pride of the German advance, were often reduced to crawling at a walking pace, pausing constantly to be pulled free by other vehicles. Infantry, meant to follow behind the armor, often overtook it on foot, slogging through the muck with rifles slung over their shoulders. The horse's burden. One of the often forgotten aspects of the Wehrmacht was its reliance on horses. Despite its reputation for mechanization, the German army used millions of horses to pull wagons, artillery, and supplies. In the Rasputitsa, these animals suffered terribly. Horses pulled until their muscles gave out, collapsing in the mud. Many died from exhaustion, hunger, or drowning in flooded fields. Their carcasses littered the roadsides, attracting flocks of crows. Soldiers, themselves hungry, sometimes resorted to slaughtering weakened horses for meat. The loss of horses crippled the German supply system. Without them, wagons sat abandoned, artillery pieces were left behind, and soldiers went without supplies. The mud consumed not only vehicles and men, but also the very animals on which the Wehrmacht depended. The Soviet advantage. While the Germans struggled, the Soviets adapted more easily. Their armies, though battered and retreating, were more accustomed to the conditions. Soviet vehicles, often lighter and simpler, handled the mud better than their German counterparts. Supply wagons pulled by sturdy Russian horses or even oxen fared better in the quagmires. Most importantly, The Soviet Union fought on home soil. Civilians knew the land, its seasons, and its hardships. Partisan fighters used the mud to their advantage, ambushing convoys trapped on the roads, then vanishing into the forests. For the Soviets, the Rasputitsa was not merely a natural disaster, it was an ally. Life in Moscow during the mud season. While German armies floundered in the fields, Moscow continued to prepare for siege. The rains fell on the capital as well, turning construction sites for defenses into pits of mud. Civilians digging trenches and anti-tank ditches worked in the rain, their clothes soaked, their hands blistered. Food shortages grew worse. With supply lines disrupted and refugees streaming into the city, bread rations were cut further. Lines outside bakeries stretched for hours in the cold rain, yet the people endured. Their hardships mirrored those of the soldiers at the front, creating a shared sense of sacrifice. The mud season gave Moscow precious time. Every day that the Germans struggled to move was another day for the Red Army to regroup, another day for reinforcements to arrive from the east, another day for the city to fortify itself. Stories from the front. Accounts from both sides reveal the human dimension of the Rasputitsa. German soldiers described trying to pull trucks free with ropes, only to watch them sink deeper into the muck. Entire convoys spent days moving a few kilometers. Some soldiers recalled standing guard in trenches filled with water up to their knees, their feet numb and raw from constant wetness. Soviet soldiers, though enduring the same mud, often wrote with grim satisfaction about the German struggles. One Red Army officer recalled watching German tanks bogged down in a swamp, easy targets for artillery. Another soldier described the sight of abandoned German vehicles, stuck fast and left behind. For the Soviets, the mud seemed like justice, a punishment delivered by the land itself against the invader. The psychological toll. Beyond the physical hardships, the Rasputitsa inflicted a heavy psychological burden. For the Germans, who had believed the campaign would end quickly, the endless mud was demoralizing. Soldiers who had expected to march triumphantly into Moscow by autumn instead found themselves crawling forward at a snail's pace, wet, cold, and exhausted. The optimism of the summer gave way to frustration and despair. Some began to wonder if the campaign could succeed at all. Rumors spread of endless Soviet reserves, of winter approaching, of an enemy that would not collapse. The dream of a quick victory faded, replaced by the grim reality of a long and uncertain war. For the Soviets, the mud was a source of hope. Every German truck stuck in the mire, every horse that collapsed, every soldier slowed by the quagmire was another sign that the enemy could be stopped. The Rasputitsa gave them time, and time meant survival. The role of weather in war. The impact of the Rasputitsa highlights a broader truth. In war, weather and terrain can be as decisive as any general or battle plan. The German army, designed for speed and maneuver, was crippled by conditions it could not control. The Soviet Union, vast and harsh, wielded its climate as a weapon. This was not the first time an invader had struggled with Russian weather. Napoleon's Grande Armée had marched into Russia in 1812, only to be consumed by winter and exhaustion. Now, more than a century later, the Wehrmacht was experiencing a similar fate. The Rasputitsa was a reminder that the Eastern Front was unlike any battlefield in Europe. Its size, its climate, and its people created challenges that no amount of planning could overcome. As we reflect on this season of mud, we can picture the scenes with quiet clarity. Long lines of soldiers bent under heavy packs, trudging through fields that seem endless. Trucks abandoned by the roadside, their wheels spinning uselessly, horses straining, collapsing, and lying still in the muck. We can imagine the silence of the countryside, broken only by the sucking sound of boots in mud, the distant rumble of artillery, the cawing of crows over carcasses. The landscape itself seemed to resist the invader, swallowing his strength, sapping his will. And in the distance, Moscow waited. Strengthened by each day, the mud held the enemy back. The Rasputitsa of autumn 1941 did not win the war for the Soviet Union, but it played a crucial role in saving Moscow. By bogging down the German advance, it bought time. Time for reinforcements to arrive, time for defenses to be built, time for winter to descend. For the Germans, the mud was a nightmare they had not anticipated, a force they could not overcome. It marked the beginning of the end of their dream of a quick victory in the East. For the Soviets, the Rasputitsa was a reminder that the land itself was an ally. The rains, the mud, the vastness of Russia all worked together to slow the enemy. As October turned to November, the mud began to freeze. The ground hardened, the air grew colder, and snow began to fall. The Rasputitsa had ended, but another enemy was waiting: the Russian winter. The rains of October eventually faded, and the endless seas of mud began to harden. The Rasputitsa had slowed the German advance almost to a halt, but now the seasons were shifting again. By November, the ground froze beneath the first frosts of winter. What had once been a swamp turned into a brittle crust of ice, firm enough for tanks and trucks to move once more. For the German High Command, it seemed like a reprieve, a chance to restart Operation Typhoon and resume the push to Moscow. But the coming of winter in Russia is not simply the arrival of snow. It is the slow tightening of a vice. The air grows colder, the winds sharper, and the days shorter. Frost creeps into bones and machines alike. What begins as inconvenience soon becomes suffering, and what begins as suffering soon becomes survival. For the Wehrmacht in 1941, winter was an enemy far more merciless than any army. The early frosts. In early November, the weather seemed to favor the Germans. The cold firmed up the ground, allowing their stalled vehicles to move again. Convoys rolled eastward, and the panzers began to lurch forward. Soldiers welcomed the change, glad to leave behind the mud that had made every step a misery. But the relief was short-lived. Temperatures plunged quickly, far beyond what the Germans had prepared for. In many places, the mercury fell to 20 degrees Celsius, then to 30 and lower still. The cold was not a passing chill. It was a deep, unrelenting freeze that gripped the land. German soldiers, outfitted for a campaign that was supposed to end in autumn, still wore their light summer uniforms. Thin wool coats, leather boots, and cloth caps offered little protection against the icy winds. Gloves were scarce, winter coats almost non-existent. Many men wrapped rags around their hands and feet, desperate for warmth. Some stuffed straw into their boots to ward off frostbite. Machines in the cold. If men suffered, so too did the machines on which the Wehrmacht depended. German tanks and trucks, marvels of engineering in Europe, faltered in the Russian winter. Engines refused to start in the frigid mornings. Oil froze solid, fuel lines cracked, and batteries died. Weapons jammed as metal contracted in the cold. Soldiers resorted to lighting fires under engines to warm them, only to risk igniting fuel or damaging delicate parts. Tracks snapped, tires split, and lubricants congealed into useless paste. Aircraft, too, struggled. Engines froze on the ground while pilots braved icy skies with frost forming on their goggles. Every kilometer gained was hard fought, not only against Soviet resistance, but against a climate that seemed determined to destroy the invaders. The human toll. The human suffering was immense. German soldiers wrote of nights spent shivering in foxholes, their breath freezing in the air, their blankets stiff with ice by morning. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, forcing amputations. Hunger gnawed at men already weakened by the cold. Some soldiers burned furniture, fences, even wooden houses to keep warm, leaving villages stripped of shelter. Others huddled together, passing bottles of schnapps, trying to dull the pain. Letters home spoke of unending cold, of comrades who froze to death in their sleep, of despair growing with each day. For many, the winter became a battle for survival as much as for Moscow. The iron discipline of the Wehrmacht began to fray under the relentless freeze. The Soviet preparation. The Red Army, though battered, was better prepared for the cold. Soviet soldiers were issued heavy coats, fur hats, felt boots, and mittens. Their uniforms, designed for Russian winters, allowed them to endure conditions that crippled their enemies. Soviet equipment was also more reliable in the cold. The T-34 tank, with its wide tracks and simple mechanics, moved more easily across frozen ground than German panzers. Soviet rifles, less delicate than their German counterparts, were less likely to jam. Even the sleds and skis used by Soviet troops gave them an advantage in mobility. Most importantly, the Soviet spirit was hardened by familiarity. Russian soldiers had known winters like this all their lives. They understood how to build fires, how to march in snow, how to endure the cold with stoicism. What crushed German morale gave Soviets a sense of grim resilience. Life in Moscow in winter. As the front drew ever closer, Moscow itself sank into winter. Snow fell on the Kremlin, blanketing its red walls in white. Streets filled with drifts, cleared daily by citizens with shovels. The breath of horses and men hung in the frozen air, while trams rattled through icy streets. Bombing raids continued, but Muscovites grew accustomed to the sirens, descending into metro tunnels to wait out the explosions. The tunnels themselves became shelters where families spent nights in relative warmth and safety, bundled together under blankets. Food remained scarce. Bread rations were cut again, and queues stretched long in the freezing wind. Yet the people endured. Posters proclaimed, "The enemy will freeze in our land." For Muscovites, the cold was a weapon, a reminder that Russia's greatest ally was the winter itself. The Wehrmacht at the gates. By late November, German forces were close enough to threaten the capital directly. Reconnaissance units reached towns like Klin and Khimki, just kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow. Some soldiers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin in the distance. It seemed for a fleeting moment that victory was still within reach. Yet each step closer came at unbearable cost. Divisions that had begun the campaign with tens of thousands of men were reduced to fragments. Vehicles stood idle, frozen in fields. Supplies failed to arrive, stuck on impassable roads. And all the while, Soviet resistance stiffened. New divisions brought from Siberia and the Far East joined the defense. These troops, hardened by cold climates and battle-tested, would soon play a decisive role. The psychological war. For German soldiers, the winter was not only a physical ordeal, but a psychological one. The dream of a quick, triumphant campaign had faded into a nightmare of endless cold. Morale sank as men realized they would not be home for Christmas, as Hitler had promised. Instead, they faced an enemy who seemed to grow stronger as the weather grew worse. For Soviets, the winter was a source of pride. Propaganda emphasized the image of Germans freezing in the snow, unprepared for Russia's climate. Soldiers were told that winter was on their side, that the land itself was fighting for them. The difference in morale was stark. Where German spirits flagged, Soviet determination grew. Moscow was not merely surviving, it was holding firm. Stories of survival. The winter of 1941 produced countless stories of endurance. A German soldier might describe standing guard in temperatures so low that rifle bolts froze to his hands. Another wrote of cooking thin soup over a fire made from broken furniture, sharing the meager warmth with comrades huddled close. On the Soviet side, soldiers dug deep shelters into frozen ground, lining them with logs and straw. They marched in white camouflage through snowy forests, striking suddenly at German positions. Civilians in Moscow carried buckets of water through icy streets, wrapped in layers of rags, determined to keep daily life alive despite the bombs and hunger. These stories, small and personal, remind us that history is not only shaped by battles and generals, but by the endurance of ordinary people in extraordinary times. The turning of the tide. By the end of November, it was clear that the German offensive had stalled. The Wehrmacht had reached the very edge of Moscow, but it could go no further. Exhaustion, frostbite, broken machines, and relentless Soviet counterattacks brought the advance to a standstill. For Hitler, this was a bitter disappointment. He had promised victory before winter, but instead his armies were frozen in place. For Stalin and the Soviet Union, it was a moment of hope. Moscow still stood, and the Germans were faltering. The winter that had once seemed a curse became a shield. The city was not yet saved, but it had endured the worst that nature and the enemy could throw at it. When we pause to reflect on this moment, we can imagine the stark contrasts. German soldiers shivering in shallow trenches, their breath rising in clouds, their rifles stiff with frost. Soviet soldiers marching steadily through snow, their fur hats pulled low, their boots crunching on ice. We can picture Moscow under snow, the golden domes and red walls of the Kremlin gleaming in the pale winter sun, while citizens shovel pathways and children play in the drifts, even as war rages nearby. The winter of 1941 was not only a season, it was a turning point. It revealed the limits of the Wehrmacht and the resilience of the Soviet people. It showed that nature could be as decisive as any battle plan. By November 1941, the harsh Russian winter had arrived in full force. The Wehrmacht, unprepared and overextended, found itself crippled by the cold. Frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion ravaged its ranks, machines failed, supply lines collapsed, and morale sank. The Soviet Union, though battered, endured. Moscow stood defiant, fortified by its people, its soldiers, and the very climate of the land itself. The German advance, once unstoppable, had ground to a halt. Winter had come, and with it, the beginning of the end for Hitler's dream of conquering Moscow. By the last weeks of November 1941, the Wehrmacht had come farther east than any invading force before them. The German Army Group Center had marched through Belarus, crossed the great rivers, and smashed through one Soviet defense after another. They had captured Smolensk, encircled armies at Vyazma and Bryansk, and now stood at the very threshold of Moscow itself. German reconnaissance units could reach villages where, on clear days, the distant outline of Moscow's spires could be glimpsed. They had arrived at the very gates of the Soviet capital. Hitler's promise of victory seemed on the verge of fulfillment, but Moscow was not a city waiting to be conquered. It was a fortress, prepared to resist with every ounce of strength. The battle for the gates of Moscow was one of endurance, ferocity, and symbolism. It was a moment when both sides poured their remaining strength into the struggle, knowing that the fate of nations hung in the balance. The German push toward Moscow. The last phase of Operation Typhoon focused on breaking the final ring of Soviet defenses around the capital. The German plan was to encircle Moscow from the north and south, cutting it off and forcing its surrender. To the north, German forces pushed toward Klin, Kalinin, and the approaches to the Volga River. To the south, they struck toward Tula, aiming to close the ring around the city. In the center, they advanced toward Khimki, just 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. The Germans threw everything they had into the offensive, but by this stage their divisions were weakened, their vehicles worn down, and their soldiers exhausted. Supplies were scarce, winter clothing almost non-existent, and frostbite was already taking a grim toll. Still, orders were clear. Moscow must fall. The defense of Tula. One of the key battles in this phase was the defense of Tula, a city south of Moscow. German forces, led by Guderian's panzer group, attempted to capture it and cut off Soviet reinforcements coming from the south. But Tula held firm. Soviet soldiers, militia, and civilians together built fortifications, dug trenches, and manned the barricades. Workers from the city's armament factories fought alongside Red Army units, defending their homes street by street. Despite repeated German assaults, Tula refused to fall. The defense of Tula was critical. By holding the city, the Soviets denied the Germans the chance to encircle Moscow from the south. It was a victory not only of strategy but of determination. The people of Tula, armed with rifles, shovels, and sheer courage, played a vital role in saving Moscow. The northern flank. To the north, German forces advanced toward Klin and Kalinin, hoping to outflank Moscow from above. Here, too, they met fierce resistance. Soviet divisions, reinforced by fresh troops from Siberia, fought desperately to hold their ground. In bitter fighting, villages changed hands repeatedly. German panzers advanced only to be halted by anti-tank defenses and counterattacks. Snow and ice made movement treacherous, while Soviet cavalry units mounted on hardy horses struck unexpectedly against German supply lines. The northern flank became a frozen battlefield where every kilometer was won at enormous cost. Though the Germans advanced, they never broke through completely. The closest approach, perhaps the most dramatic moment, came when German reconnaissance troops reached Khimki, a small town on the outskirts of Moscow, only 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. From there, they could see the faint outlines of the city itself, the domes of churches, the towers of the Kremlin, the skyline of the Soviet capital. It was the closest the Wehrmacht would ever come. For a moment, victory seemed almost tangible, but the Germans lacked the strength to push further. Soviet defenses stiffened, and counterattacks drove them back. Moscow remained beyond their grasp. Moscow under siege. Inside the city, the atmosphere was tense but defiant. The sounds of artillery could be heard in the distance. Air raid sirens wailed nightly as German bombers struck at factories and railways. Citizens dug trenches in parks and built barricades in the streets. The Moscow metro, deep underground, became both a bomb shelter and a symbol of resilience. Food shortages worsened. Bread rations shrank, and lines stretched for hours in the freezing cold. Yet the people endured. Propaganda reminded them that Moscow was the heart of the Soviet Union, and it must not fall. On November 7th, despite the danger, the Soviet leadership held the annual Revolution Day parade on Red Square. Soldiers marched past the Kremlin, saluting Stalin as he declared that the enemy would soon be defeated. From the square, many of those soldiers marched directly to the front lines. The parade was both a display of defiance and a profound morale boost. The arrival of Siberian divisions. One of the most important factors in the defense of Moscow was the arrivals of fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East. These troops, battle-hardened and equipped for winter, had been held in reserve due to the threat of Japanese attack. Once Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not invade, Stalin ordered them west. These divisions arrived in late November and early December, just as the Germans were reaching their limits. Clad in warm winter uniforms, skilled in fighting in snow, and well-armed, they brought new energy to the Soviet defense. Their presence stiffened the lines around Moscow and prepared the Red Army for the counteroffensive to come. The cost of the battle. The fighting at Moscow's gates was brutal. Villages around the city were reduced to rubble as artillery pounded them day and night. Fields were littered with the wreckage of tanks and the bodies of soldiers frozen in the snow. Civilians who had not evacuated suffered terribly, caught in the crossfire or forced into labor. German casualties mounted not only from combat but from frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion. Soviet losses were immense as well, with divisions reduced to fractions of their strength. Yet the Soviets could replace their men faster than the Germans. Reinforcements continued to arrive while German divisions grew weaker. The turning point approaches. By early December, the German advance had ground to a halt. The Wehrmacht had reached the gates of Moscow but could go no further. The combination of Soviet resistance, fresh reinforcements, and the brutal winter had stopped them in their tracks. For Hitler, it was a bitter disappointment. He had promised his people that Moscow would fall quickly, but now his armies were frozen, exhausted, and vulnerable. For Stalin and the Soviet Union, it was a moment of triumph. Moscow stood defiant, and the Germans had been halted. The stage was set for the Soviet counteroffensive, a strike that would push the Germans back and shatter the myth of their invincibility. As we reflect on this moment, we can imagine the scenes around Moscow's gates. Snow-covered fields scarred by tank tracks, villages reduced to charred ruins, soldiers crouching in frozen trenches, their rifles clutched tight, their breath rising in icy clouds. We can see the city itself, glowing faintly in the distance, its streets filled with barricades, its people wrapped in scarves and furs, carrying buckets of water through the snow. We can hear the rumble of artillery, the distant wail of sirens, the determined voices of soldiers marching from Red Square to the front. The Germans had come closer than anyone thought possible. They had reached the very edge of Moscow. But here, at the city's gates, their advance ended. The capital of the Soviet Union stood firm, its people unbroken, its defenses holding. By December 1941, the Battle of Moscow had reached its climax. The Wehrmacht, stretched to its limits, had come within sight of the Kremlin but failed to capture it. The Soviet Union, battered but unyielding, had held the line. The arrival of Siberian reinforcements, the resilience of the people, and the brutal hand of winter combined to stop Hitler's armies. Moscow had not fallen. Instead, it prepared to strike back. The battle at the gates of Moscow was more than a military struggle. It was a test of endurance, of will, of spirit, and it marked the moment when the tide began to turn. The German advance on Moscow had slowed to a crawl by late November. Frost had tightened its grip on the land, snow fell across the forests and plains, and the Wehrmacht stood exhausted at the very gates of the Soviet capital. They had marched thousands of kilometers, fought battle after battle, and captured millions of prisoners. They had destroyed armies, seized cities, and reached the closest point to victory they would ever see in the East. But they could go no further. The German divisions were spent, their soldiers shivering in summer uniforms, their tanks frozen in the snow, their supplies dwindling to nothing. For all their triumphs, they lacked the strength to deliver the final blow. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had endured its darkest hour. Armies had been destroyed, cities captured, and millions displaced. Yet Moscow still stood. And now, for the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army was preparing not to retreat, but to strike back. The plan for the counter-offensive. By early December 1941, Stalin and his generals were ready. Reinforcements had arrived from Siberia and the Far East, divisions hardened by cold and equipped with proper winter gear. Soviet intelligence had confirmed that Japan would not attack in the east, freeing these troops for the defense of Moscow. Their arrival was timely and decisive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the commander entrusted with the defense of the capital, crafted the counteroffensive. His plan was straightforward yet ambitious. Attack along the entire front around Moscow, drive the Germans back from the city, and regain the initiative. For months, the Red Army had been on the defensive, giving ground, retreating, bleeding. Now, for the first time, they would launch a coordinated offensive against the Wehrmacht. The stakes were immense. If the counteroffensive succeeded, it would not only save Moscow but also shatter the illusion of German invincibility. The opening strikes. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. It was a bitterly cold morning with temperatures plunging to 30 degrees Celsius. Snow blanketed the fields, and the breath of men and horses rose in clouds. Soviet artillery opened fire, pounding German positions with shells. Infantry advanced through the snow, supported by tanks and cavalry. Across the front, from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south, the Red Army surged forward. The Germans, caught off guard, were stunned. They had believed the Soviets were finished, that Moscow was about to fall. Instead, they now faced fresh divisions, well-equipped and determined. German soldiers, weakened by cold and exhaustion, struggled to hold their lines. The Siberian divisions. The role of the Siberian divisions cannot be overstated. These troops, drawn from the farthest reaches of the Soviet Union, were accustomed to the cold. They wore warm fur hats, padded jackets, and felt boots. They moved easily through snow and ice, using skis and sleds where German troops floundered. Their presence transformed the battlefield. Where German soldiers shivered in thin coats, Siberian troops advanced with confidence. Where German tanks struggled to start, Soviet T-34s rolled forward, their wide tracks gripping the frozen ground. The Siberians fought with ferocity, launching bayonet charges through snowdrifts, ambushing German positions, and cutting through enemy lines. Their arrival was not only a tactical advantage, but a psychological one. To the Soviets, they symbolized fresh hope. To the Germans, they were a chilling sign that the Red Army was far from defeated. The German retreat. The counteroffensive struck hardest at the German flanks. To the north, Soviet forces recaptured towns like Klin and Kalinin, driving the Germans back. To the south, they relieved Tula, which had held out through weeks of siege, and began to push German forces away from the city. In the center, the Germans were forced into retreat. Units that had once dreamed of marching into Moscow now fell back through snow-covered fields, leaving behind vehicles, weapons, and frozen comrades. The Wehrmacht, which had advanced with such confidence, now struggled to survive. The retreat was chaotic. German divisions, already weakened, were unable to hold their positions. Commanders ordered withdrawals, sometimes against Hitler's insistence to stand and fight. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed thousands of men. The once proud Wehrmacht was reduced to stumbling columns, trudging westward through snow and ice. The role of the T-34. The Soviet T-34 tank played a decisive role in the counteroffensive. Its design, simple and robust, made it well suited to the Russian winter. With wide tracks that distributed its weight, it could move through snow and mud where German tanks bogged down. Its sloped armor deflected shells, and its powerful gun could knock out German panzers. During the counteroffensive, T-34s spearheaded many attacks, breaking through German lines and supporting infantry. Their presence boosted Soviet morale and terrified German soldiers, who often found themselves unable to match the tank's strength. The T-34 became a symbol of Soviet resilience, a machine that embodied the harsh, practical strength of a nation fighting for survival. The human side of the offensive. For Soviet soldiers, the counteroffensive was both grueling and exhilarating. After months of retreat, they finally pushed forward. The cold still bit deep. The battles were still bloody, but the sense of momentum shifted. Each village recaptured, each trench retaken was a victory that fueled their determination. German soldiers, in contrast, endured despair. Letters from the front described the shock of facing fresh Soviet divisions, the agony of retreating through snow, the endless suffering of cold and hunger. Some wrote of comrades collapsing in the snow, too weak to continue, their bodies left behind. Others spoke of the humiliation of abandoning weapons and equipment, of fleeing from an enemy they had once considered inferior. Behind the lines, civilians watched the tides shift. Villages that had suffered under German occupation were liberated, though often left in ruins. Families emerged from hiding, embracing soldiers with tears and relief. The counteroffensive was not only a military turning point, but a moment of profound human renewal. The strategic impact. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back between 100 and 250 kilometers from Moscow. Though the city was still scarred and threatened, it was no longer in immediate danger. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed unstoppable, was forced into its first major retreat of the war. The psychological impact was enormous. Across the world, observers had watched the German advance with dread. Now, for the first time, there was proof that Hitler's armies could be halted, even defeated. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. For the Allies, the news brought hope. For the Soviets, it was a turning point, a moment when the tide of despair began to ebb, replaced by cautious confidence. The Red Army had not only defended its capital, it had struck back. Hitler's response. In Berlin, Hitler was enraged. He refused to acknowledge the scale of the defeat. Blaming his generals for retreating without his orders, he demanded that German units hold their positions at all costs, regardless of losses. This rigid command worsened the suffering of his soldiers, trapping them in exposed positions where they froze or were overwhelmed by Soviet attacks. The rift between Hitler and his generals widened. Many commanders recognized the impossibility of holding ground in the Russian winter, but Hitler's refusal to yield turned strategic withdrawals into disasters. His insistence on standing firm cost the Wehrmacht dearly. Life in Moscow. After the counteroffensive began. Inside Moscow, the news of the counteroffensive spread quickly. For months, the city had lived in fear of imminent capture. Now, the danger was lifting. Citizens heard of villages liberated, of Germans driven back, of the Red Army advancing. The atmosphere changed. Hope returned to the streets. Bread was still scarce, bombs still fell, and winter still pressed heavily on daily life. But the sense of survival, of endurance, grew stronger. Moscow had faced the storm and held. Now it was watching the enemy retreat. To imagine this moment is to see a frozen battlefield transformed. Columns of Soviet infantry marching forward, their rifles glinting in the pale winter sun. Cavalry galloping through snow, sabers flashing, tanks rumbling steadily, their tracks cutting deep into ice. In contrast, German soldiers stumbling back through snow, their uniforms ragged, their faces hollow, their weapons abandoned in the frost. Villages littered with the wreckage of war, burned-out tanks, shattered wagons, empty helmets half buried in snow. And beyond it all, Moscow itself, its skyline shining under a blanket of snow, its people warmed by the knowledge that the invader had been stopped. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 was more than a military action. It was a statement to the world. The Red Army would not collapse, the Soviet Union would not be destroyed, and Moscow would not fall. The offensive drove the Germans back from the city, inflicted heavy losses, and shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. It was the first great defeat of Hitler's armies, the moment when the tide of war began to turn. For the soldiers who fought it, for the civilians who endured it, and for the city that survived it, the counteroffensive was a triumph of resilience, endurance, and determination. The winter that had seemed like a curse became a shield, and Moscow remained unbroken. The Battle of Moscow, fought through the late months of 1941 and into the frozen days of December, had ended with a German retreat and a Soviet counteroffensive. For the first time since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's armies had not only failed to achieve their objectives, but had been driven back. The impact of this battle was immense. It reshaped the course of the war, altered global perceptions, and inflicted wounds on both armies that would never fully heal. The consequences of the Battle of Moscow were not only military. They were psychological, political, and human. The story of this moment in history is not just about tanks and soldiers, but about the survival of a city, the endurance of a people, and the turning of the tide in a war that had seemed unstoppable. The immediate aftermath for Germany. For the Wehrmacht, the winter retreat from Moscow was devastating. German divisions, already weakened by months of fighting, were battered further by Soviet attacks and the brutal cold. Estimates suggest that the Germans suffered over 500,000 casualties in the campaign, killed, wounded, captured, or incapacitated by frostbite and illness. The dream of a quick victory in the East was shattered. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June with promises of a swift triumph, had bogged down into a war of attrition. The Wehrmacht, which had marched across Europe with lightning speed, now faced a conflict it could not easily control. Strategically, the Germans had failed to capture Moscow. This was more than symbolic. It meant that the Soviet government remained intact, the rail and communication hub of the nation still functioned, and the Soviet war machine could continue to operate. The German advance had been halted at the very point where it mattered most. The immediate aftermath for the Soviet Union. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Moscow was a triumph of survival. The capital had endured air raids, shortages, and the constant threat of capture, but it had not fallen. Stalin's government remained in place, the Red Army had regained its confidence, and the people of Moscow had witnessed the retreat of the enemy from their gates. The psychological effect was enormous. For months, the Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic defeats. Millions of soldiers had been killed or captured, and vast territories had been lost. Yet now, at Moscow, the Red Army had not only held, but had struck back. The myth of German invincibility was broken. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. It was no longer only about survival. It was about pushing the enemy back, about regaining lost ground, about believing that victory was possible. The global reaction. The consequences of the Battle of Moscow were felt far beyond the Soviet Union. Around the world, observers had watched the German advance with dread. Many believed that the Soviet Union would collapse under the pressure, as France had in 1940. The German propaganda machine had declared that the Red Army was finished, that Moscow would fall in weeks. But the Soviet victory at Moscow changed those perceptions. For Britain, which had stood alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France, it was a moment of relief. Prime Minister Winston Churchill praised the resilience of the Soviet people, recognizing that the Eastern Front would now pin down the bulk of Hitler's armies. For the United States, soon to enter the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the defense of Moscow was evidence that the Soviets would remain a vital ally. Globally, the battle reshaped the narrative of the war. Hitler's aura of invincibility was tarnished, and the idea that the Axis powers could be defeated began to take hold. The strain on German morale. Among German soldiers, the failure at Moscow was a heavy blow. Letters and diaries from the front reveal exhaustion, despair, and a growing sense that the war would not end quickly. Men who had marched east in June, believing in swift victory, now found themselves shivering in frozen trenches, fighting an enemy who seemed only to grow stronger. The winter retreat left deep scars. Thousands suffered from frostbite, losing fingers, toes, and limbs. Others endured hunger as supply lines collapsed under the strain of distance and weather. Entire units were reduced to fragments, their strength broken by months of relentless combat. The Wehrmacht remained a formidable force, but its confidence was shaken. The image of an unstoppable army had been tarnished, and the reality of a long war began to sink in. The cost for the Soviet Union. Though victorious, the Soviet Union paid a staggering price for the Battle of Moscow. Estimates suggest that over 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the campaign. Entire families were torn apart, villages destroyed, and vast regions left in ruins. The human suffering was immense. Civilians endured bombings, hunger, and displacement. Those living under German occupation faced atrocities, forced labor, and mass executions. The Red Army's triumph came at a cost measured not only in military losses but in human lives and broken communities. Yet the Soviet people accepted these sacrifices as necessary for survival. The defense of Moscow became a symbol of endurance, a rallying point that gave meaning to the hardships of war. The political consequences. Politically, the Battle of Moscow strengthened Stalin's position. His decision to remain in the city, to oversee the defense personally, and to preside over the November 7th parade on Red Square reinforced his image as a leader who would not abandon his people. The survival of the capital bolstered his authority both within the Soviet Union and among the Allies. The battle also deepened the Soviet commitment to total war. The mobilization of industry, the evacuation of factories to the east, and the integration of civilians into the defense effort became permanent features of the Soviet war strategy. Moscow's survival proved that such measures worked, encouraging the regime to push them even further. A turning point in the war. Historians often debate when the Second World War began to turn against Germany. Some point to Stalingrad in 1942, 1943, others to El Alamein or Midway. But the Battle of Moscow was undeniably the first great turning point on the Eastern Front. Until December 1941, the Wehrmacht had known only victory. From Poland to France to the Balkans, Hitler's armies had swept aside their enemies with breathtaking speed, but at Moscow, they were stopped. For the first time, the tide had shifted. The failure of Operation Typhoon marked the end of Hitler's dream of a quick war in the East. The conflict became a long, grinding struggle of attrition, fought across vast distances and in brutal conditions. The Germans would never again come so close to capturing Moscow, and the Soviet Union would never again be so close to collapse. The broader context. The consequences of the Battle of Moscow must also be seen in the broader context of late 1941. While German forces faltered before Moscow, Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into the war. Within days, Germany declared war on America, ensuring that it would now face a global coalition of powerful enemies. The coincidence of these events reshaped the war entirely. The Axis powers had gained dramatic victories in 1940 and 1941, but by the end of that year, the tide had begun to shift. The Soviet Union had survived, the United States had entered the conflict, and Germany now faced a war on multiple fronts that it could not easily win. Human endurance. Perhaps the most profound consequence of the Battle of Moscow was the demonstration of human endurance. The soldiers who dug trenches in frozen ground, the civilians who built barricades and endured bombings, the workers who dismantled factories and rebuilt them far to the east, all became part of the story of survival. For German soldiers, too, the battle revealed the limits of endurance. Many froze, starved, or collapsed under the strain. Their suffering was immense, and their letters home speak of longing, despair, and the crushing weight of the Russian winter. The battle revealed the extremes to which human beings could be pushed, and the resilience they could still find within themselves. As we reflect calmly on the consequences of the Battle of Moscow, we can see its significance with clarity. A city that was nearly lost had been saved. An army that had seemed unstoppable had been halted. A war that had appeared destined for German victory was now uncertain. We can picture the frozen fields where men lay, their uniforms stiff with ice. We can see the ruins of villages, the smoke rising into the winter sky. We can imagine the relief of families in Moscow hearing that the Germans had been driven back. And we can hear the silence of winter nights, broken only by distant artillery, marking the end of one phase of the war and the beginning of another. The Battle of Moscow was not the end of suffering, nor the end of war. Years of struggle lay ahead, with battles even more terrible still to come. But it was the moment when the tide began to turn, when survival gave way to hope, and when the world realized that Hitler's armies could be stopped. The consequences of the Battle of Moscow were vast and enduring. For Germany, it was the first great defeat, a blow to morale, strategy, and reputation. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph of endurance and a turning point in the struggle for survival. For the world, it was proof that the tide of war could shift, that the Axis powers could be resisted, and that victory was possible. Moscow's survival ensured the continuation of the Soviet war effort, strengthened the Allied coalition, and marked the beginning of the long road to Berlin. The winter of 1941 had stopped Hitler's advance. The consequences would echo through the years that followed, shaping the course of the Second World War and the history of the 20th century. The guns eventually fell silent on the frozen approaches to Moscow. Snow blanketed the fields where armies had clashed, covering the wreckage of tanks, the scattered helmets, and the shallow graves hastily dug in icy ground. By the end of the winter of 1941-1942, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back from the gates of Moscow. The Soviet capital had endured. The story of the Battle of Moscow is not simply the story of one campaign. It is the story of a turning point in history, of a city that stood when all expected it to fall, of a people who endured unimaginable hardship, and of a war that shifted direction because winter, resilience, and determination combined to halt Hitler's advance. As we reflect on the battle, its legacy emerges not only in military terms but in human memory, political consequence, and the way it shaped the destiny of nations. Moscow as a symbol. Throughout the war, Moscow remained more than just a city. It was the political heart of the Soviet Union, the administrative hub, and the symbolic center of resistance. If Moscow had fallen, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Stalin's government might have collapsed, the Red Army might have fragmented, the Soviet Union itself might have ceased to exist. But Moscow did not fall. Its survival sent a message to the world. The Soviet Union would fight on, no matter the cost. The city became a symbol not only for its own citizens, but for all who resisted fascism. It was proof that Hitler's armies could be stopped. The November 7th parade, held on Red Square even as German forces approached, became one of the enduring images of the war. Soldiers marched past Stalin, then directly to the front lines. The parade was more than ceremony. It was a declaration that Moscow stood firm. That image, carried in photographs and film, would echo long after the snow melted. The turning of the tide. Historians often describe the Battle of Moscow as the first great turning point of the Second World War. Until that winter, the Wehrmacht had swept through Europe with astonishing speed. Poland, France, the Balkans, all had fallen quickly. Even in the Soviet Union, the summer and autumn of 1941 had been a series of disasters. But at Moscow, the Wehrmacht met its limit. Blitzkrieg, designed for short, sharp campaigns, faltered against the vastness of Russia, the resilience of its defenders, and the brutality of winter. The German army, for the first time, was forced into retreat. The psychological impact was immense. Around the world, the myth of German invincibility was broken. For the Allies, Moscow's survival meant that the Soviet Union would continue the fight, tying down millions of German soldiers. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of a long war they had hoped to avoid. The cost of victory. The triumph of Moscow was not without terrible cost. The Red Army lost more than 1 million men in the campaign, killed, wounded, or captured. Civilians endured bombings, starvation, and cold. Villages across Western Russia were destroyed, their inhabitants executed, deported, or left homeless. For German soldiers, the cost was also enormous. Hundreds of thousands perished from combat, frostbite, and exhaustion. Vehicles and horses were lost in staggering numbers. The retreat from Moscow left scars, both physical and psychological, that would never heal. The snow may have covered the battlefields, but beneath it lay the grief of countless families. The victory was real, but it was paid for in blood. The Global War. The Battle of Moscow cannot be separated from the wider events of late 1941. As German troops struggled in the snow outside Moscow, Japan struck at Pearl Harbor. Within days, the United States entered the war and Hitler declared war on America. Suddenly, the conflict became truly global. The survival of Moscow meant that the Soviet Union would remain in the war, while the entry of the United States brought vast resources and manpower to the Allied side. The combined weight of Britain, the Soviet Union, and America would eventually crush the Axis powers. But in December 1941, none of this was yet certain. What was certain was that Moscow had stood and that the Soviet Union still fought. That fact alone reshaped the war's future. Stalin and leadership. Politically, the battle cemented Stalin's role as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. His decision to stay in Moscow during the crisis, his presence at the November parade, and his speeches to the nation reinforced his authority. To many, he embodied the will of the Soviet people to endure. At the same time, the battle hardened the Soviet system of total war. Industry was mobilized, civilians were conscripted into defense work, and the state tightened its grip on every aspect of life. The survival of Moscow was used as proof of the correctness of Stalin's leadership, and it strengthened his power for the remainder of the war. The German miscalculation. For Hitler, the failure at Moscow was a bitter disappointment. He had expected the Soviet Union to collapse quickly, as other nations had done. He underestimated the size of the country, the endurance of its people, and the ferocity of its climate. Operation Barbarossa, meant to deliver victory in a matter of months, had instead led to a prolonged war of attrition. The Wehrmacht had reached the limits of its power. From this point onward, every advance would be harder, every victory more costly, and the chance of decisive triumph would grow smaller. The winter before Moscow revealed the flaw at the heart of Hitler's strategy. He had underestimated his enemy. Human endurance. The legacy of the Battle of Moscow lies not only in strategy, but in the endurance of those who lived through it. Soldiers who dug trenches in frozen ground, who fought in snowstorms, who marched through ice with rifles in their hands. Civilians who endured bombings, hunger, and cold, yet still built barricades and carried water. Workers who dismantled factories and rebuilt them far to the east, ensuring that the Red Army had tanks and planes to fight with. The battle revealed the strength of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Their stories, often untold, form the foundation of the victory. Memory and commemoration. In the decades after the war, the Battle of Moscow was remembered as one of the great triumphs of the Soviet people. Monuments were built, books written, and films produced to honor the defenders of the city. The battle became a symbol of patriotism, endurance, and sacrifice. For those who lived through it, the memory was often painful. Families remembered loved ones lost, winters of hunger, and the fear that had gripped the city. Yet they also remembered the pride of survival, the knowledge that they had endured one of history's greatest trials and prevailed. As we reflect quietly, we can picture the final scenes of the battle. Snow falling softly over fields scarred by war. The distant sound of artillery fading as the front moved westward. The city of Moscow lit by winter sun, its people walking through icy streets with a new sense of hope. We can imagine the soldiers, exhausted but triumphant, standing in the snow as the enemy retreated. Their breath rising in clouds, their faces lined with fatigue, but their eyes alive with the knowledge that they had achieved the impossible. And we can picture the silence of the frozen night, broken only by the creak of ice and the whisper of wind through bare trees, as the land itself seemed to rest after months of fire and fury. The legacy. The Battle of Moscow shaped the course of the Second World War. It was the first great defeat for Nazi Germany, the moment when the tide began to turn. It proved that Hitler's armies were not invincible, that the Soviet Union would not collapse, and that the war would be long and costly. For the Soviets, it was a triumph of survival and resilience. For the Allies, it was a sign of hope. For the Germans, it was the beginning of a long retreat that would eventually end in Berlin. Its legacy endures not only in history books, but in the memory of all who lived through it. The battle stands as a testament to the power of endurance, the strength of a people united, and the way in which nature itself can shape the destiny of nations. The story of the Battle of Moscow is the story of a winter that stopped Hitler. It is the story of mud, snow, frost, and fire. It is the story of soldiers who fought in unimaginable conditions, of civilians who refused to yield, of a city that stood when the world thought it would fall. When we reflect on it, we see more than strategy and statistics. We see humanity at its most tested, its suffering, its endurance, and its will to survive. As the snow covered the fields in the winter of 1941, Moscow remained unbroken. That fact alone changed the course of the war, and with it, the course of history.